I need a disclaimer for this video. I love Man of Steel. Man of Steel is a beautifully written and directed contemporary take at Superman. I love this film. But there's some, let's say, there's a legacy of this film that for the people who don't like it, the hardcore Superman fans, some of the mainstream general audience who don't like this film, like to blame Zack Snyder for the so-called problems of this film. Christopher Nolan and David Goyer were absolutely in control and in charge of this movie. Now, Zack was brought on to direct this movie by Christopher Nolan because of his ability of a visual narrative, of his visual storytelling. Zack Snyder is a beautiful modern day director. He really knows how to use modern filmmaking technology as a paintbrush, and we've discussed that many times on this channel. It was not Zack Snyder's decision to have Superman be in a no-win scenario where he had to break Zod's neck. It was not Zack Snyder's idea within the tornado sequence to have Clark Kent stand there and allow his father to die. The narrative journey, the authority of the narrative journey was all on David Goyer. It was his film. It was David Goyer's vision from the very beginning. He was the one who had writer's block during The Dark Knight Rises and came up with a vision for a Superman movie. And he quickly went and told Christopher Nolan, and Christopher Nolan went, great, let's take it to the studio. So we've got to be absolutely clear about this, because there's been this kind of fabrication that if you don't like Man of Steel, if there's elements you don't like about Man of Steel, you blame Zack Snyder. Zack Snyder was in charge of the visual storytelling, but he wasn't in charge of the entire movie. This was David Goyer's movie. Now, as I say, I love Man of Steel. I love all of it. I don't necessarily have any problems with the movie, but there's moments in this movie, there are problems with this movie that could have been easily solved. The problem is David Goyer seemed to have the attitude of, I'm going to do whatever I do, and the hell with it, and to hell with it. And you can't do that with Superman, right? When you're doing an original story with original characters, you can have your artistic freedom and your artistic integrity. Nobody cares what you do because no one has a preconceived idea of what your movie is. But when you're dealing with pre-existing intellectual properties, IPs, you've got to tread carefully. Also, David Goyer seemed to treat Superman in this movie like he treated Batman. You can't do that. You've really got to tread carefully when it comes to Superman, or any pre-existing, iconic, legendary character that everybody knows everything about. And Goyer kind of went in this with the attitude of a ball in a china shop. Now, David Goyer wrote one of the greatest, best comic book movies of all time, The Dark Knight. There's no question, David Goyer is a very talented writer. I feel he did a really good job with this movie. But there were certain things that he did that he shouldn't have done. And by doing those things, he stopped himself from being able to write a sequel, to flesh out the rest of the DCEU. Because my attitude towards this is there's Man of Steel, then there's the other movies, right? Zack Snyder was in complete control of Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice and the Snyder Cut, and he oversaw David Ayer's Suicide Squad until the studio started to interfere and meddle with that movie. He was very much involved with Wonder Woman 2017 until the studio meddled with that third act as well. Patty Jenkins was not Zack's choice to direct Wonder Woman 2017. He had another female director in mind, and again, it was studio meddling from Jeff Johns that brought in Patty Jenkins. It's also important to remember that. there's two kind of core pinnacle moments within Man of Steel that a lot of hardcore Superman fans and the general mainstream audience have a problem with. First of all, it's that tornado flashback sequence that people have an issue with. I think generally people really enjoy the tornado flashback sequence. I like the idea of it. The idea of it is that Clark has such respect for his father, he allows him to die, as he tells Lois before we see that flashback sequence. I trusted my father. That's why I let him die. There's a trust there. But for a lot of people who know this character, who have read this character, don't believe for one single moment that Clark Kent would just stand there and allow his father to die. Now, I personally like the idea of what he was trying to do, but maybe the implementation and the narrative execution of that weren't the right way to go, wasn't the right direction. Because when you look at Smallville, when you look at how Jonathan Kent dies in Smallville, it's a similar thing, right? Jonathan Kent dies by sacrificing himself, by protecting Clark's secret. It's the same thing in the tornado sequence in Man of Steel. Jonathan Kent dies trying to protect Clark's secret. I think audiences were fine with that. The problem people had that Clark stood there and allowed his father to die. And for many people, that didn't ring true. Although I don't have a general strong feeling towards it, it is utterly compelling and heartbreaking and sad. I understand why people have a problem with it, and I certainly think there were different ways that Goyer could have went at it that would have been better. And you could still have it in the framework of that tornado sequence. Now, ultimately, it went down the way it went because Christopher Nolan was in total control of this film. He wanted his partner, who he'd worked with in 3 previous movies, the Dark Knight trilogy, to have his vision. So basically Goyer was allowed to do whatever he wanted. But there were times when even Nolan questioned Goyer, because Nolan was a fan of Superman 78. He became a director because of the great job Dick Donner did with Superman 78. So even Nolan at times kind of said, hang on, David, this is Superman, mate. Even I like, realism and stuff like that, but I think we're kind of taking the piss a little bit here. And I think if only David found a better way to tell the story of Jonathan Kent's sacrifice and death in that tornado sequence, then audiences wouldn't have had a problem. It's a great sequence, so there is that. But then there's the destruction in the movie and the fact that while Superman's fighting Zod, buildings are falling on the floor and clearly people are dying, and Superman isn't saving lives. And again, people are questioning this. Superman wouldn't allow this to happen. Now, their explanation about this was, like, this is a real world Superman. Superman can't be in 6, 7 different places at the same time. He's either going to fight Zod or save people's lives. He can't do both. And if he starts trying to save people's lives, Zod's going to pummel the shit out of him. Now, if we go to Superman 2, where we have a similar scenario where Superman's fighting the 3 villains from Krypton, it's a little bit different. We see Superman stop the bollard hitting the pram with the mother and the baby. We see him at times saving people's lives while fighting the villains. And, Richard Lester did this in a really clever, believable way as well. But we must remember, by Superman 2, Superman in Superman 78 had already been trained by Jor-El in the Fortress of Solitude for 5 years. Our Superman in Man of Steel had no training. He had to put the costume on. Zod had, began his invasion of Earth. He had no choice to intervene without any training. He only had a brief conversation with Jor-El, played by Russell Crowe, in the movie. So there are differences there. Again, I don't have any issue about the destruction. the fights and all of that. And even the fact that Superman has to fight Zod instead of saving individual people's lives, right? But a lot of people picked that element apart. But the core issue that hardcore Superman fans had with this movie was the no-win scenario that Superman was placed in by David Goyer, and Superman having to break Zod's neck. Was this a step too far? Again, I'm a hardcore Superman fan. I've loved Superman since I watched Superman 78 as a boy. Superman 78 was the first film I ever saw. It made me fall in love with movies. I wanted to write and create and perform because of Superman 78. But it doesn't mean everything has to adhere to Superman 78. But despite me not having strong feelings about Superman breaking Zod's neck, I do feel it was a mistake. I've said many times, I've gone on record many times saying that if it wasn't for that moment, Man of Steel would have made around $1 billion, maybe more. You look at Man of Steel, it looks outstanding. The writing and the storytelling is outstanding in many places. But it's these incidents that I'm explaining right here that caused the film problems. Again, disclaimer for people who are chewing too many pies to understand what I'm doing with this video. I'm talking about how David Goyer was in control of this film, not Zack Snyder, and if things were done differently, if David Goyer was able to take a step back from what he wanted in certain areas of the movie, he would have been able to flesh out more Man of Steel movies and flesh out the DCEU. And because of the controversies around certain things that he wrote within the movie, that wasn't to be. And from that moment on, the DCEU was in trouble in terms of hardcore DC and Superman fans' points of view and the general audience. It didn't have the best of reputations. So you have this incident where Superman's in this no-win scenario. He doesn't just kill Zod, he breaks his neck. Now, Zack's already explained that his Snyderverse, his Man of Steel movie, and it's not just his Man of Steel movie, he wasn't in complete control, as we've already said, of this film, was an adult Superman movie. It was for adults. His movies are for adults, as he barked at Scott Mendelson that day on Twitter. And that's true. But when you're dealing with intellectual properties, IPs, with characters like Superman, as I say, you've got to tread really, really carefully, and they didn't. You can't have Superman breaking Zod's neck. You want kids and families to sit there and enjoy the movie, because the reason that you're adapting this intellectual property is also to make money. You want a good balance. You want to make a great artistic movie, but you also want to bring families, parents, chomping on their popcorn, enjoying the movie, right? And once you do things like Superman breaking Zod's neck, certain parents are going to say, well, I can't really bring my kids to watch this movie, and that's the issue with it. Now, I've explained before what I would have done with the ending of this movie. I wouldn't have had Superman break Zod's neck. Superman, Zod, and the rest of the Kryptonians would have been sucked in with the other Kryptonians into the Phantom Zone. That would have been the ending, the cliffhanger ending of the movie. In the second movie, Brainiac comes to Earth. While Brainiac's on Earth, Superman and the rest of the Kryptonians are trapped in the Phantom Zone. They're not getting on at first, but then they decide to work together to get out of the Phantom Zone. So, Zod and Superman start to put their differences behind them. They put their heads together, they get out of the Phantom Zone, they go back to Earth and discover that Brainiac has taken over the planet. And they work together, along with the rest of the Kryptonians, to fight Brainiac. Brainiac's about to murder Superman, but Zod, in a moment of great sacrifice, gets in the way and sacrifices his life for Superman. Imagine what a beautiful arc that would have been for Zod, considering what he did in Man of Steel. That would have been brilliant. I know it's my idea. Even though it's my idea, if I come up with a crap idea as a writer, I will say it's a crap idea. I think this would have worked better. So I feel that the mistake with Man of Steel, and as I say, I love the movie, it did some things that shaved against the grain, and that's what ruined everything. That's what hurt the rest of the DCEU. Because if Goya's allowed to stay, then you don't have Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice as the sequel. And I can quickly, briefly explain to you, maybe we'll do this more tomorrow, why Superman and Batman being in the same movie, in only the second DCEU movie, doesn't have the effect it would have had 4 or 5, 6 movies down the line. Imagine, in 6, 7 movies' time, you've got a Batman versus Superman movie, and they took their time. But Warner Brothers, it was their idea to force Batman into that movie. And again, I love BVS. I think it's a great fucking movie. But again, it's not for everyone. And when you're making, as I say, these intellectual properties, they're meant to be for everyone. And that really was the problem. But if you don't like Man of Steel, you should certainly put the problems you have with its narrative with David Goyer and not Zack Snyder.